But I think without showing you the rise, the fall wouldn't have the same credibility. So let's look at what happened. It was strange because Colorado had been funded with dedicated funding. I'll get into more details on that, but there was a nemesis, a guy named Douglas Bruce, and I just Googled him because I haven't checked him out in recent history, and if you want, have a look at Wikipedia. They've got a big, long section on Douglas Bruce. He was from Colorado Springs, and he was kind of a right-wing populist politician type who's had various successes and failures in terms of getting elected, including, I just read, it was past all of this, and more recently, that he finally got elected to the legislature in Colorado. And it was the first person in Colorado history to ever be censured formally by the legislature. So he's a bit of a character. And he came up in 1992. Well, no, he started earlier. He was the leader behind something called Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, otherwise known as TABOR. And he tried to get this amendment into the Constitution of the state of Colorado twice before it finally passed in 1992. And he finally got the votes for an amendment that said no new taxes or tax increases without going to the voters in a referendum. In other words, the legislators couldn't make the decisions, even though you're supposed to be electing them so they can actually think about all these issues, as opposed to a referendum question on the spot with 20 different items on it. And this amendment, which is either known as the Tabor Amendment or the Bruce Amendment, passed finally in 1992. Since then, there's been a movement called de-Brucing Colorado. The problem was that the state's funding, like yours, was dedicated. It didn't come just from a bed tax, so it was a broader tax including rental cars and some other tourism-related categories, but it was a small tax of 20 cents on every $100 worth of spending. So in other words, 0.2%, almost negligent, and it was on tourists mostly. I mean, there was a bit of in-state, but mostly it was outsiders coming in who are putting money into the Colorado State Treasury, right? Just like what you were talking about this morning. 0.2%. It started actually at 0.1%, and after 5 years it seemed to be working so well that the legislature voted to extend it to double it basically to 0.2 and to extend it for another 5 years. But like most of these types of legislation, the authors were cautious. They didn't want it to go in perpetuity. There had to be some checks. So there's something called a sunset clause. The sunset clause expired in 1993. And so technically, the tourism tax had to disappear. And now, instead of what would have happened, which was that it was under the radar, the legislature was happy with the performance of the Colorado Tourism Board. You know, they had good evidence that all of this was working. Now, all of a sudden, it had to go to the voters to referendum. And the killer for them was the wording on the ballot talked about a new tax of $15 million. I think it had gone up to $15 million then, if I have my facts right. But it was framed as, to the voter, as a new tax. Well, technically it was, because the old one expired until it was renewed, right? So, again, having, as I said, done polling, issues polling and financial polling for treasurers, I've never seen a tax that voters particularly liked. I mean, they'll kind of go along with taxes if it's funding things that they believe in. But generally speaking, the idea, if you ask people on a ballot, and this was a referendum that had a whole pile of questions, do you approve of a new tax for promoting tourism of $15 million? Well, that was a tough sell. So what did the industry do to try and make their case? And I think, again, there may be a few learnings for you here, but just a few things to be cautious about. Yes, and I know how important tourism is and how important it is in this state. But trust me, the Colorado experience shows that it's not enough on its own to go in and talk about how important you are. That's a mistake that the Colorado industry made. And again, they had some ski resorts with some money. They had a very strong industry, just like you have a very strong industry here. There's the ski resorts. Yours is the gaming side. But they talked about themselves. They ran $1 million television campaign showing smiling faces from people in the industry saying, you know, we're your tourism industry and look how important we are. But it didn't address the one issue that anybody cared about, which was it's a tax. And furthermore, the industry had no spokesperson. And they were facing Douglas Bruce, who had the ear of the media and was getting millions of dollars worth of pre-publicity that was more credible for that kind of thing. And when you're in an issues debate, advertising doesn't work very well. It works great for marketing. But in this kind of situation, if you're up against a credible opponent, you know, a Greenpeace, if you're an environmental disaster like some of the polluters, you don't have a lot of credibility by running an ad campaign. What was Bruce's response to the industry? He said, well, you know, the Rocky Mountains were there long before the Colorado Tourism Board. They'll still be there afterwards. And, you know, he was absolutely right. The mountains were still there. We're just fewer tourists. Number two, and this is where he killed him, and this was a day or two before the vote, and the press picked it up. He said, if the Fat Cat ski resorts can afford to spend $1 million on running propaganda television ads, they can afford to do the marketing. Why are they lining up at the public trough? You know, it's a classic case, and it must be my old brain operation and psychology background, but, you know, I kind of look at it as there's the left brain, which is rational, and we're all trained to think rationally, right? And then there's the right brain, the emotional side. And most of what I've seen, certainly in marketing, if you can hit the emotional hot buttons, it's got much more power than our left brain logical answers. And that's exactly what happened. You know, the mistake the industry made there was to ignore this advice, which is beware the rational response to the emotional desire. And Bruce's message resonated at an emotional level. On the eve of the vote, the voters shot down the tourism tax in the 93 referendum, 55% against. Colorado became the only state without an official tourism function. And the funding was effectively, other than remaining private sector, which was mostly winter and ski. And this, by the way, was all at that time promoting summer, not winter, because it was left to the ski industry to promote winter. So this was helping the moms, the pops, the little guys out in the mountains, a few bigger players, but mostly small business. Sound familiar, rural Nevada? So I live in Toronto, as I said, and our local newspaper, I saw a story showing Rocky Mountains, beautiful mountain wilderness, a travel story, travel section. Headline said, Colorado, the phones are still ringing, but there's nobody there to answer them. So what happened to their business? Well, according to our tracking research, again, very large scale, several 100,000 interviews a year, we found that Colorado's market share of overnight trips plunged. It plunged just over 30% within 2 years, and by 2004, was down 37%. And market share is the most meaningful indicator because overall business volume can go up, down, and sideways with recessions and et cetera. The question in terms of where you really at is what's your share of grabbing those travelers.